The letter taped to my front door had urgent HOA violation stamped in red like it was some kind of federal warrant. I tore it off and skimmed the nonsense. Ongoing noise complaint regarding canine disturbance during quiet hours. Fine, $100. Additional fines to accrue if not resolved. My dog, Tater, is a 12-pound senior mutt with 2 teeth, a limp, and the bark of a dying squeaky toy. He doesn't even have the lung capacity to disturb anyone. But apparently, Rebecca Cranston, our HOA vice president and proud owner of the world's most aggressive bob haircut, thought otherwise. I was still standing at the door in my gym shorts when she strutted up the walkway like she owned the place. "Yarek Zeller," she said, like she was disappointed I still existed. "We've had multiple complaints about your dog barking past 10 p.m. I stared at her. "He sleeps in a heated blanket by 9. Who's complaining?" "Several neighbors," she said, arms crossed, "and I've heard it myself." "You'll need to keep him indoors." "He is indoors. He sleeps more than you do." She didn't laugh. "HOA rules are clear. Disturbances are subject to fines. Consider this your first warning." "Right," I said, already deciding I wasn't going to just pay $100 for a lie. That night, I sat on my porch with a thermos of bad coffee and set up my security camera to record the yard. No barking, just wind chimes and the distant hum of traffic. Typical. But then, around 11, something else lit up the night: loud music, laughter, clinking glasses. It came from 2 streets over Rebecca's backyard. I walked over, stayed just outside her fence line, and hit record on my phone. She and 3 other HOA board members were tossing back wine, screaming over karaoke, and hosting what could only be described as a suburban bacchanal. I watched one guy in cargo shorts fall into the pool. So that's what quiet hours look like for the HOA. By the time I walked back home, I had 20 minutes of footage, crystal clear audio, and a plan forming in my head. If they wanted to play games, I'd bring the whole damn rulebook. But first, I printed out the HOA bylaw on noise ordinances and highlighted every section in yellow. Then I stapled it to a formal complaint form, added a USB drive with the footage, and dropped it in the HOA's official correspondence box at the clubhouse. The next morning, I got a call from Rebecca. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked my dog past her house. Tater waddled like a furry potato. She watched us through her blinds, jaw clenched, game on. By Thursday, the entire HOA board had gone radio silent, which would have been a relief if it didn't feel like the eye of a storm. I wasn't naive. They weren't retreating. They were regrouping. I spent the morning reviewing our community bylaws, digging into every clause that could be used against them. The bylaws were sloppily written, probably a Frankenstein draft cobbled together by whoever founded the HOA 15 years ago. But I found what I needed in Section 9, Article 4. Noise disturbances during posted quiet hours are subject to escalating fines, enforceable on any resident, including board members. No exemptions. That clause was my hammer. I printed 3 copies and mailed them certified to each board member. No more informal drops in the suggestion box. I wanted signatures confirming receipt. If they were going to play bureaucratic games, they'd learn I was fluent in that dialect. That night, something strange happened. 2 houses on my street had motion sensor lights installed on the side yards, new ones. Bright ones. They triggered every time someone walked past, and they were aimed low, directly into the street, which meant they lit up my house like a theater stage every time someone jogged by or a raccoon blinked. I walked over to the first house, owned by one of the board members, Phil. He answered the door with a practiced casualness, holding a cup of something that smelled like cheap bourbon. "The lights," I said, pointing. "They've been triggering all night." He leaned on the doorframe like he'd just discovered he had bones. "Security's important, Yarek. You never know who's wandering around at night." "Is that right?" "Sure is. Some people round here have been real jumpy lately." His grin was too wide to be friendly. "So you installed floodlights aimed at my front porch. Coincidental, I guess." I nodded slowly. You know, Phil, I was just reading up on light pollution ordinances. City Code 3412 says fixtures visible from public streets that cause unreasonable glare are considered a violation. Fines start at $200, escalate quickly. His smile twitched. You gonna report me? Already did. But hey, coincidences happen. I turned and left without waiting for a goodbye. By the next morning, the lights were readjusted, still obnoxious but not blinding. I filed that under small victories. Then came the flyer. It was tucked under windshield wipers, pinned to community bulletin boards, even taped to the doors of residents' sheds. Community standards matter. A call for civility. It read in a serif font that tried too hard to be authoritative. Below was a passive-aggressive screed about certain individuals who were weaponizing bylaws and sowing division through surveillance and hostility. I stood in front of the bulletin board outside the clubhouse, reading the flyer until a neighbor walked up beside me. "Who do you think wrote it?" she asked. "Hard to say," I said, though I could practically see Rebecca's ghostwriter fingerprints all over it. "Whoever it was, they sure don't like being held accountable." She plucked a flyer down and folded it into her purse. "Makes you wonder what else they've been getting away with." That was all I needed to hear. I started knocking on doors. Not to gather gossip, this wasn't about popularity. I wanted witnesses. I wanted statements. And I found them. A couple who lived across from Rebecca told me they'd submitted 3 complaints over the last 4 months about the same loud weekend parties. I'd recorded none of which had ever been acknowledged. An elderly man down the block said he'd been fined for having a hummingbird feeder, despite no such rule existing in the bylaws. A nurse who worked night shifts said her request for noise reduction near the tennis courts during her sleep hours was lost twice. I compiled everything: written statements, complaint copies, time-stamped photos, and the footage from my camera. It was enough to make a city inspector raise both eyebrows, which is exactly what happened when I brought it all to the Office of Community Oversight. I scheduled a formal review with a municipal compliance officer named Javon Mercer. He had a calm, methodical presence and eyebrows that said he'd seen more than one HOA implode under pressure. "You understand this isn't just about noise complaints," I told him. "They've been selectively enforcing rules, suppressing complaints, and retaliating against residents who push back. That's abuse of power." He flipped through the folder, nodding. "I've seen it before. But this is thorough. You documented everything, every page, every clip." He tapped the file. "You mind if I loop in the city attorney?" I was hoping you would. The next week was quiet, but not the peaceful kind. It was the kind of quiet that made you check your locks twice before bed. Then, a white city vehicle parked outside the clubhouse. Javon stepped out with another man in a suit. They spent 2 hours inside. People watched from their windows but didn't dare come out. When they left, they took a box of files with them. The board called an emergency meeting that Friday. They posted the notice with only 24 hours advance, a violation of their own transparency policy. I showed up anyway. The room was tense, filled with folding chairs and faces that looked more curious than supportive. Rebecca sat at the head table, flanked by Phil and Denise, the treasurer. The 4th board member, Carla, was conspicuously absent. "We've received a number of mischaracterized complaints," Rebecca began, her tone brittle. "And we'd like to address them directly." I raised my hand. "You'll have time to speak later," she said sharply. "I'm not here to speak," I said. "I'm here to deliver this." I walked to the front and set down a folder on the table. "Formal notification from the city attorney's office. You're under investigation for abuse of authority and failure to comply with municipal code." A ripple went through the room. Rebecca's face drained of color. "This is outrageous." Javon had coached me for this part. "You'll need to provide the last 2 years of fine revenues, including how they were allocated. Also, every complaint received and how it was resolved or ignored. There's a subpoena coming next week." Phil stood up, stumbling over his words. "You don't have the right to, the city does," I said. "And if you want to contest it, you can do so in court. but good luck explaining the karaoke parties under the quiet hours clause. That shut him up. A woman in the back of the room, someone who'd never spoken at a meeting before, stood and asked, "Is that why my complaint about the broken storm drain was ignored? Because I'm not on the board?" Another voice followed. "Why was I fined for letting my kid draw with sidewalk chalk, but they can host parties till midnight?" It snowballed. Residents who'd stayed silent for months were finally speaking up, voices layered over each other, some angry, others hurt. But all asking the same thing. Why were the rules only enforced when it benefited the board? The meeting dissolved into chaos. Rebecca adjourned it early, hurrying out with her folder clutched tight like it could shield her from accountability. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. By Monday, Carla, the missing board member, resigned. She posted a letter explaining she'd tried to raise concerns and was shut down every time. She was cooperating with the investigation. City auditors arrived 2 days later and began combing through HOA records. Residents were interviewed. Patterns emerged. The fines collected from violations were funneled into an unapproved discretionary fund. That fund was used to cover board events, including catered parties, spa retreats, and even a wine subscription service, all technically paid for by the residents they were targeting. That wasn't just unethical, that was embezzlement. The city pressed charges. Rebecca was removed from her position pending legal proceedings. Phil and Denise resigned under pressure, both facing civil penalties. A temporary oversight committee was installed, led by volunteers from the neighborhood. I wasn't on it. I didn't want control. I wanted accountability. Tater, for his part, was awarded a clean record and a fresh peanut butter treat from nearly every neighbor on the block. He accepted them with dignity and promptly fell asleep on my welcome mat. The flyers vanished. The lights stayed adjusted. And for the first time in a year, our neighborhood felt like it belonged to the people who actually lived there, not the ones who tried to rule it. 2 weeks after the city audit began, a patrol car parked outside the HOA clubhouse just before sunrise. Officer Keating, a broad-shouldered woman with a no-nonsense walk and a clipboard tucked under her arm, stepped out and headed toward the front door with purpose. She didn't knock. She used a key provided by the city's interim oversight committee. That key had previously only been held by board members. Inside, she was joined by Detective Lewis Marin from the county's Financial Crimes Unit. The audit had uncovered something deeper, something that went beyond skimming party funds and ignoring complaints. There were falsified invoices. Payments issued to vendors that didn't exist. And worst of all, a series of forged signatures on budget approvals, including one from a homeowner who had been deceased for 6 months at the time. I knew about the investigation because I'd been asked to provide my original complaint forms and video files again, this time as part of a legal evidence chain. The city attorney wanted to show a pattern of mismanagement and retaliation. But Detective Marin was looking for something else, intent to defraud. That morning, I sat across from him at the municipal building, a legal pad in his hand, a recorder on the table between us. "Walk me through your first interaction," he said, not looking up as he wrote. "Start with the initial letter." "I found it taped to my door," I said. "No warning, no context, just a fine and a claim that my dog was disturbing the peace." He nodded. "And you're certain he wasn't? He's nearly deaf and sleeps most of the day." "I've got 3 weeks of footage that proves it." He scribbled something. "You said you filed a complaint after witnessing a late-night gathering. More than just a gathering. It was a board-hosted party after hours with music loud enough to rattle windows 2 streets away. I recorded everything. Did you notice anyone exchanging money, any signs of hired vendors?" "No," I said, "but there were catering trays, delivered, not homemade." "Interesting." "Our records show no catering expenses logged for that month." That was the moment I realized this was bigger than HOA petness. This wasn't just about fraud, it was about laundering community funds through fake vendors and ghost expenses. People had paid dues expecting their streets maintained and their park benches fixed. Instead, they'd funded wine tastings and spa weekends. Later that day, Detective Marin and Officer Keating served a search warrant at Rebecca Cranston's home. I didn't see it myself, but word traveled fast. The moving truck that had been idling in her driveway all morning was turned away. She hadn't even packed properly, just a few suitcases thrown into the back of her Lexus, and a confused-looking cat in a carrier. By dusk, every mailbox in the neighborhood had a pale blue notice from the city legal office. It explained that the HOA was under formal criminal investigation, that all dues were to be temporarily suspended, and that a court-appointed financial trustee would be reviewing the last 3 years of expenses. I found Phil 2 days later, sitting on a bench near the retention pond, staring at the water like it owed him answers. He looked worn down, eyes sunken, shirt wrinkled. "You know," I said, standing a few feet away, "if you'd just told the truth from the start, this wouldn't have happened." He didn't look over. "I didn't sign up for this." "No," I asked. "Then why approve the fake landscaping invoices? Why create a vendor called Greenscape Solutions that doesn't exist?" Rebecca said it was standard practice, said it kept the budget looking clean. "That's not a defense, that's complicity." He rubbed his temple. "She said the board deserved perks for the stress. For what we deal with." "You mean the residents you ignored?" He finally turned to face me, eyes hollow. "You think I don't know that now? I think you knew it then and didn't care." That ended the conversation. The court hearing was scheduled for the following week. It wasn't a criminal trial yet, but a civil injunction to freeze HOA accounts and remove the remaining board members from any financial authority. I sat in the gallery, flanked by neighbors I'd barely spoken to before all of this started. A retired librarian on my left handed me a copy of her own complaint from last year, a request for sidewalk repairs, that was denied while the board approved a new espresso machine for their private lounge. The judge, a sharply dressed woman with an efficient cadence, listened patiently as the city auditor presented charts, receipts, and affidavits. Then came the testimonies. A single mother explained how she was fined repeatedly for unsightly lawn maintenance while recovering from surgery, yet her requests for deadline extensions were ignored. A veteran from the corner unit spoke about being denied permission to install a flag mount while the board approved new patio furniture for themselves. Each story built the same picture: selective enforcement, personal gain, and a culture of intimidation. Then it was my turn. I stepped up, placed a USB drive on the evidence table, and looked directly at the judge. "I never set out to expose anyone," I said. "All I wanted was for my dog to be left alone, but I wasn't just being fined, I was being targeted. And once I started looking deeper, I realized it wasn't just me. This isn't about a barking dog, it's about power, about people who were supposed to serve the community and instead served themselves." The judge nodded slightly, and I stepped down. It took less than 10 minutes for her to rule. All financial authority stripped, accounts frozen, and the former board members barred from serving on any residential committee pending further investigation. But the real hammer fell 2 days later. Detective Marin returned, this time with a second warrant. He traced one of the shell vendor's Greenscape Solutions to a P.O. box registered under Phil's name. Another, Civic Events Group, was tied to a business license Rebecca had filed under a different last name, her maiden name. They were arrested that afternoon. Charges included misappropriation of community funds, falsifying documents, and obstruction of municipal oversight. The city attorney announced that the case would be pursued to the fullest extent of the law, especially in light of forged signatures and the use of deceased residents' names to approve budgets. The neighborhood changed after that. The interim committee held open meetings on Saturday mornings at the park. No more locked clubhouses, no more blind votes. People showed up. They brought coffee, folding chairs, and ideas. We repaired the benches ourselves. One of the retired mechanics tuned up the lawn equipment and mowed the common areas for free. The nurse who'd been ignored now oversaw the new scheduling committee. And the flag mount. It went up with unanimous approval. I never joined the new board, I didn't need to. I'd done what I set out to do. Tater, as always, remained blissfully unaware of the role he'd played. He spent most of his days sunbathing on the porch, occasionally lifting his head when someone walked by to offer a wheezy yawn. People greeted him by name now. Kids brought him treats. Someone even crocheted him a tiny vest that read, "Neighborhood Hero." We never got another noise complaint. And the next time I passed Rebecca's old house, now stripped of its luxury fixtures, blinds gone, for sale sign crooked, I didn't feel vindictive. I just felt done. 3 months after the arrests, the neighborhood felt like it had exhaled. Lawns didn't look like magazine covers anymore, but people waved more. Garage doors stayed open longer in the evenings. Kids rode bikes without whispered warnings to stay off that lawn. And neighbors who used to keep to themselves started borrowing tools and sharing chili recipes. Something cracked open when the HOA crumbled, and whatever crawled out was a lot more human. The city's trustee continued to comb through the HOA's records, and what surfaced made the initial fraud look like pocket change. Over the past 4 years, the board had withdrawn over $80,000 in discretionary expenses money that was supposed to go toward road resurfacing, drainage maintenance, and lighting upgrades. Instead, it paid for a wine of the month club, 4 private weekend retreats at a mountain lodge under fake conference titles, and a consulting contract with a non-existent firm that turned out to be a joint bank account held in another county under Denise's brother's name. The city didn't waste time. Charges were expanded: mail fraud, wire fraud, falsifying public documents, and conspiracy to commit theft from a community association fund. The state attorney general's office got involved. A grand jury convened. No deals were offered. I was asked to testify again, this time in a larger courtroom with cameras stationed outside. I wore the same gray blazer I used to wear when I worked in city planning years ago, back before I took early retirement and moved into this peaceful neighborhood. Funny how life circles back. The prosecutor's questions were sharp but respectful. He walked me through the timeline of events, asking about the footage I'd submitted, the complaints I'd gathered, the bylaws I cited. I stuck to the facts. Every statement I made had supporting documentation. Every accusation came with a date and an exhibit number. By the end of my testimony, the defense attorneys looked like they were flipping through empty folders. Back home, I found a note on my porch. Not taped, not stamped, just tucked under a potted fern. It was from Carla, the former board member who'd resigned early and cooperated with the investigation. She apologized for not speaking up sooner, said she'd been intimidated, threatened with removal, fines, and public embarrassment if she questioned anything. But she also thanked me for setting things in motion. She'd taken a job with a nonprofit that supported HOA reform and was working with other communities now. I didn't write back, but I kept the note. In the weeks that followed, sentencing hearings were scheduled. The court opted for public proceedings, part of a transparency initiative tied to community fraud cases. I sat in the back row, not out of spite, but to see the final note of a song I'd been forced to hear for too long. Rebecca was given 5 years, with no chance of parole for at least 3. Denise got 3 years and was ordered to pay restitution. Phil, who had fully cooperated once the investigation expanded, was sentenced to 1 year of house arrest and 5 years probation. He was also banned from serving in any fiduciary role for life. The restitution order meant they'd spend the next decade repaying the community, penny by penny. With the board dismantled and the investigation closed, the city dissolved the HOA's legal authority. Management of shared spaces was turned over to a newly formed neighborhood council, voluntary, transparent, and subject to city oversight. No dues, no fines, no secret meetings. Just monthly gatherings in the park where people sat on folding chairs and drank lemonade while talking about potholes and garden swaps. The first council vote wasn't about fences or shrub height. It was about the community fund, what to do with the recovered money once the restitution started trickling in. Suggestions ranged from building a dog park to installing solar-powered streetlights. Someone proposed a scholarship fund for residents pursuing public service careers. The vote was postponed so more people could weigh in something that never would have happened under the old regime. One afternoon, while I was replacing the latch on my gate, my neighbor Louis walked over. He was a retired paramedic with a laugh that sounded like gravel in a coffee can. "You ever think it'd get this far?" he asked, nodding toward the street where kids were chalking hopscotch grids without anyone yelling at them. "Not in a million years," I said. "Thought maybe I'd get the fines dropped. Didn't expect to dismantle a suburban crime ring," he chuckled. "You ever think about running for council?" "I've had enough of bylaws for one lifetime." He leaned against the fence. "Well, if you change your mind, people listen to you. That's rare around here." I didn't say anything right away, just tightened the final screw on the latch and tested it once. Clean click. Later that week, I got a letter from the City Office of Residential Affairs. Not a complaint, a thank you. It said the case had led to a review of over 24 other HOAs across the county. Several were already being audited. Policies were being rewritten. Oversight tools were being developed. All because one resident had decided to push back. I pinned the letter inside my garage next to my dartboard and my old city planning badge. Above it, I hung a photo one of the neighborhood kids had taken of Tater, lounging in the sun, wearing a tiny paper crown. The crown was part of a joke gift from the neighbors along with a plaque that read, "To the dog that brought down a kingdom, Tater didn't care." He still spent most of his time curled up on the welcome mat, twitching in his sleep like he was chasing something important. Maybe he was, but the rest of us, we were finally awake.